All right, welcome everybody to our From Service to Solidarity conversation today. This is being hosted by Peace Catalyst International. If you are not familiar with Peace Catalyst, just want to take a couple of minutes and introduce you or refamiliarize yourself with us. At Peace Catalyst, we dream of a world where neighbors know and care for each other so that they can flourish together. And we dream of a world where the church is helping to make that a reality. And I think many of us are familiar with churches where that is not the case. At Peace Catalyst, we focus on bringing this world into being, particularly by helping Christians and the communities around us to reach across divides and partner for the good of all. And at PCI, we do this both by equipping people, Christians and our neighbors, with the skills and theology and vision for peace, and also by empowering local peace builders to catalyze change. We have people all over the world who are doing the hands-on peace building work, which is a lot of what you'll hear from Steve today. I like to talk about Peace Catalyst as a global network of Christian peace builders. You can see we're scattered across the US and most continents. We're a team that's growing a movement to peace in the church and beyond. We don't just want to do this work ourselves, but we want to see it grow. We want to see the church get behind this, and we want to see the church be known for peace and justice and not the opponents of it. And Peace Catalyst is a community following Jesus' way of peace together. There are a lot of us who have found this vision of peace in the Gospels, have been led by Jesus to this way of peace, and have struggled to find other people who get that. Peace Catalyst is a place where, whether you're on staff or you're just part of our community, we are doing this together. If you're interested in getting involved, we would love for you to get involved. You can check out our website. The link is down there at the bottom. If we have peace builders in your area, go join them, do stuff with them. They likely have various events going on. And if not, we have regular events and calls like this to happen. You can sign up for our workshops, our courses. We have pilgrimages. We lead workshops both in person and virtually here on interpersonal conflict, the foundations of peace building, community organizing, trauma healing. And we also lead pilgrimages. We have one that occasionally goes and learns from peace builders in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And we have one coming up this summer that is going to learn from peace builders in Israel and Palestine. If you would like to accompany that, you can still sign up over the next week or two. And Nicole will drop some of these links in the chat as she's able. So we would love for you to go to Palestine, Israel with us. We have a bunch of resources, small group curriculums, peace building guides, blogs, podcasts on our website. Please check it out. And if you are also looking for a network or a community to do this with, or you know others who are, you can volunteer with us and do this in your community. You can crowdsource and come work with us. There are other ways to be part of our community. Come join us, hang out with us. I'm going to see this grow. And as executive director, I am very happy to invite you to help support this work. We thrive off of donations. We take few grants and absolutely no government money for doing this. Just about all of our income comes through personal donations, both our individual peace builders and our organization as a whole. You can use this link or this QR code. If you want to donate to Peace Catalyst, you get to support events like this. You help us to grow our equity fund for under-resourced and indigenous peace builders across the world who don't have their own networks to support, to fundraise from. It helps us to empower and mobilize the church through more things like this and the resources we put out. And also helps to cover our administrative work and community and the work of people like Nicole and coaching, so that our peace builders can focus on what they're doing on the ground and not have to worry about all the back end that takes up so much time. We are at the moment really trying to meet this goal of getting 100 new recurring donors at $50 a month, so that we can build up what we are able to do and grow our work and see it spread further and see this peace building movement spread further. If you were able to help with that, we would love to have you on board. All that said, let's come into today's conversation. From service to solidarity, what does it look like for us, especially those of us who are from safer and more privileged backgrounds, to actually stand alongside those who are suffering? how do people who are facing violence and oppression actually want us to show up for them, to show up with them? And what sort of relationships and postures do we need to go beyond just putting band-aids on people's wounds and to actually address the root causes of oppression? We'll get into this today with our peace builder in South Africa, Steve Schallert. Just a bit of his bio here. He's a peace builder and organizer and educator. He practices and teaches Kenyan nonviolence. He lives in Cape Town. He has a history of developing and facilitating conflict transformation schools and projects in a range of different sites of struggle and places of conflict across the world. He's particularly passionate about developing young peace and justice practitioners. And at the moment, one of his many roles, he's very busy, is as the director of international solidarity with Ezekiel Lamakabani, which is a faith-based support center in Africa. And I'm sure he will share much more of that as we dive in. And if you are inspired by what he is doing and you want to support him directly, I'm going to keep coming back to this. There's his link there at the bottom if you want to learn more about him or connect with him or help support his work. And so let's dive into it, shall we? You good to go, Steve? All right. Yeah, I want to give just a moment. I'll give you the super brief intro. I want to let Steve introduce himself a bit. So, Steve, can you share a bit more about yourself and your work, and how did you come? Let's say, how did you come into peace building, and how did you come to this idea of solidarity being so important for the work you're doing?
Sure. Thanks, Peter, and thanks to you, friends, for being here. It's good to see your faces, and good to spend this time together. I think I'm the only one who's in the wee hours of the night. So, just to say, down here in South Africa, it's already quite late. So my pistons in my mind might not be firing as quickly as normal, but um, yeah, blessed to be with you and to see your faces and to have this conversation. Um, yeah, I don't ever really know how to answer that question. I, gosh, I really came of age in the wake of 9/11. In a time, I'm American by trade historically, though I've been in South Africa for 15 years and was in Afghanistan for quite a while before that. But um, I, I, I was in my first year of university when 9/11 happened. Grew up in a Christian family in Europe, but had moved to the States and walked through this deep existential crisis, as I think a lot of people do, as they kind of come of age, especially people who grew up in faith traditions, trying to figure out who the hell you are and what in the world it means to follow this Jesus person. And to do that in the context of what America was reeling through in the midst of this great tragedy and atrocity, and then the aftermath of that in particular, when this drumbeats of war was fermenting. And I think for the first time in my life growing up, I really saw the intersection between faith and violence start to really merge with one another, and these deep calls for retribution. And the songs on Sunday began to sound, similar to the songs throughout the week that were looking towards revenge and a desire for a particular form of justice to be brought, right? And it was in the midst of that I was in my early 20s and having this existential crisis of faith. And one day, I was in Grand Rapids, Michigan at the time, and I stumbled upon this group of clergymen who were in the midst of being arrested at the front doors of an Army recruitment center in Grand Rapids. And I watched all of these men and women of faith get arrested in a posture of solidarity with the people of Afghanistan at the time who were being bombed. And I I watched this happen, and I said I had this thing inside of me, right, that just went, okay, if this is what following Jesus looks like, I can do that. And so for the next about 20 years, I mean, my life took a hard detour into this messy work of peace building. One of those men getting arrested was a man named Daniel Berrigan, who I think many of you, maybe some people are aware of, others are not. But Daniel became a guiding light in my life and somebody who spoke very deeply into my life. And um, basically, for the coming decades, I just found myself constantly in communities and spaces experimenting with what in the world the gospel means to a world of violence. And the question around solidarity for me became fermented, I think, through mountains of seasons of watching my greatest intentions fail miserably. And all of these, being a part of so many communities and peace protests that turned violent, and communities of peace that were anything but peaceful internally, and just asking these deep, deep questions and failing deeply along the way. Um, so yeah, I don't know. We've been in South Africa. I've been in South Africa now for the last 15 years, working in all kinds of different frameworks, primarily engaged in the question of peace and justice through the history of apartheid, and what does it mean to do spatial justice work in a city like this one in Cape Town, South Africa, which is different, but not that different from many other cities in the world that are spatially segregated across economic lines and racial lines. And for me, particularly as a white American foreigner, um, for an economic middle class man who basically ticks every box of social, political, racial, and economic power. The question of solidarity and what is it even like? What is my part in the question of suffering and pain in a city like this has always, I think, been at the forefront of my mind, and stumbling through those types of questions to try to figure out what in the world I'm supposed to do or not do, and that's not always an easy thing to come to terms with. So I don't
Mm,
know. That's me. Pete, do you have any other questions or
and
thoughts as far as
I,
entering?
I, I'd actually love to hear before we move on with this. Um, I was interested in like what are people's spiritual roots or foundations, especially in their upbringing. Um, eh, if I were to put myself in your shoes and I saw that the protest of the clergy outside of the recruiting office, I would have responded to that very differently from when I was 15 to when I was 22 to when I was 25, and the amount
Yeah,
of
yeah.
change that happened over then. Um, but then some people grow up in spaces where like they're already primed to be asking those questions, thinking about that. So yeah, kind of what primed that path for you to be wrestling with that in your early 20s?
I mean, I think well, I mean, I grew up in a peace church space, right? So I grew up as a Quaker kid, but I grew up in a Quaker space that had, that wasn't really historic and had by and large moved into just kind of a, uh, pseudo evangelical imagination. But I don't know. I mean, I think growing up in I grew up in Germany and then moved to the States my freshman year of high school, which is the perfect time to move anybody internationally. It's really helpful for your sense of being and psyche. Um, and
Mm,
I I landed in America in an existential crisis, I think, as a cross-cultural kid, right? And so trying to navigate American cultural dynamics, I never felt grounded in it, and I was discontent enough about American cultural dynamics that by the time like my faith began to mean anything, it had fallen apart a couple times already, and so I don't know, it's hard to describe all of the internalized discontent that was already there that kind of
mm,
found its peak in seeing a community of people, Daniel in particular, that who I got to know very deeply after that, but seeing somebody who, I mean, you can imagine for me, somebody who is that off balance sees something so solid, right?
mm,
Of just like a community of people who knew who they were, knew why they were willing to risk arrest and whatever comes from that in light of their convictions. Like I had no convictions. I was this kid growing up in no man's land, right? And so yeah, I don't know. It's like an instant draw to that.
Mm, Steve, thank you.
So,
Mm. Maybe just set the stage for the rest of this conversation. Um, so today's call is called From Service to Solidarity. And we called it that, recognizing that solidarity can either be an unfamiliar term for a lot of folks, or it can have negative connotations. There are a lot of folks who
mm,
grew up with strong reactions to solidarity tied to communism or something else that they've been taught is a very negative thing.
mm,
And even in positive spaces, it can still be this kind of highfalutin abstract term.
right.
What do we mean by it? When we talk about solidarity, Steve, when you talk about solidarity, how are you defining this? What's it look like? What's it mean?
Sure. Well, I mean, I premised that by saying I think the way I would talk about solidarity is different depending on who is in the room. And so I guess I'll first say here I make some assumptions based upon how we set the framework for the conversation and looking at you friends who are here. So I'll name my assumptions first. My assumptions is that the majority of us here
Mm,
are Christian folk. I can see that most of us are melanin challenged in one way, shape, or form. We are, I assume most are somewhat middle class and, you know, maybe I'll say it this way. I assume that everybody here, um, in situations of injustice, when a moral choice needs to be made, that there's a choice of solidarity that you have the option to make or not. So maybe that's my assumption coming in. In other words, when there is unrest or there's situations of violence perpetrating or something is happening in your neighborhood or in the world, you have the option to opt out or not. That's an assumption I'm making. And so, because that's, I assume, true, the question of what solidarity means and looks like for people like myself who um, find themselves, for whatever reason, in the world and in our neighborhoods, predicating, holding within ourselves a significant amount of social, economic, cultural power. The scales are tipped in our direction, right? The question of what solidarity means. Um, it has its own, I think, invitation to it. Um, so you could come at it a couple ways. So one is etymologically, right? So solidarity, the word itself comes from the French word solidaire, which is inherited from the Latin word sodium, which means the whole sum, or the word solidus, which means solid. So etymologically, solidarity is about cultivating the solidity of the whole, right? In other words, it's the journey towards the common good. It's a re-centering, it's a decentering of ourselves for an imagination of the health and wellness of the collective body. And so, on one hand, solidarity is an imaginative process that says, I am not the center of the universe, and my imagination and my action within the world is situated on thinking about the collective, thinking about the whole community, recognizing that I am bound up in systems of existence with other creatures and human beings. And my imagination and my action in the world wants to live as if that's true. So it's an imagination that wants to walk in pursuit of the solidity, the goodness, the holding together of the whole. So we can talk about it like that. Another way to talk about it, assuming that most folks here are interested in this person of Jesus, is to talk about it theologically. So as Christian folks, um, it means situating ourselves in the lives and in the struggle for justice within our communities, which is a way of talking about incarnation, right? It means that the gospel that we carry and the good news that it purports to speak um, is needs to at least be as good for the people that the gospel lifts up as blessed. And that has a lot of connotations to it. So, I mean, so those are some, I think, initial thoughts. But solidarity, if I was to define it, is a revoking of the self as the fundamental principle, and a and a move towards the collective good.
Hmm. How how is that, I don't know, different, better, deeper, distinct from service? Because I can see um in the church I grew up in, I was taught that serving other people and loving other people is really important. And there was like a strong degree of community intentionality of we need to help the people around us. And so I can see how people would make those connections where there is that still same sort of like we need to care for people. How is this, I guess, how do you want to position this in relation to the idea of serving other people? How's it different? And what does that mean?
Right. So, I mean, service like is also not a. I think it's important to recognize both of these are they're not neutral terms, right? So, in many ways, the question is how do you embody, um, either of those frameworks? The connotation or the assumptions I bring into a conversation around service is, um, I guess I would first to say that that service is certainly needed. It's certainly beautiful. It's certainly something that we need to contend with and embody as much as we can. But I think the thing that is often fundamentally missing in any situation where service is being rendered is the question of power and whether or not power is being reckoned with in the conversation of how service is functioning. And the other thing that I think we often fail to reckon with, especially for those of us who come from the spaces that we inhabit and that we position ourselves into the work of service for those who we quote unquote call less fortunate or quote unquote see as those who are in need of our service, is that we usually embody that space, assuming that we are the ones who have and have to give, and that there are those who need to receive, and that there isn't a mutual exchange of existence or a human connectivity there that is fundamental. Um, and so to me, that's the fundamental difference, is that there isn't a reckoning of power and the power dynamics that are at play. Um, Solidarity is about everyone regaining their sense of humanity, regaining their sense of dignity and purpose. And if we can't reckon with the ways that the systems of our world and the structures of our communities have fundamentally wounded all of our humanity in one shape or another, um, then the process by which we attempt to do service will continue to deepen the divides and walls of hostility among us. And our service can very quickly become a mechanism by which those of us who experience privilege or power within our communities can wash our hands of the very needed work of engaging with the structures that produce this type of pain and the historical wounds that live within all of us. And so solidarity calls us to something much deeper. It calls us to a deeper analysis. It calls us to deeper, more painful, more beautiful work. Causes us to a cruciform life, right? It calls us to to reckon with the fact that those things that I call blessings in the context of our collective broader communities often look like curses to those who we want to render our blessings upon.
Hmm. So I'm hearing solidarity as a focus on the collective, the focus on the interdependence, how we're all connected to each other. I'm hearing
Yeah, yeah,
solidarity. I'm hearing solidarity as an emphasis on affirming and restoring the dignity and the humanity of everybody. And I'm hearing an emphasis on solidarity being um, about, would you describe it as, particularly for those of us coming from places of privilege and safety? Would you describe it as it's some power? The power is something that we let go of. The power is something that we give away. The power is something that we share. If we're moving from service and we recognize that there's a top down, I have something to give you, you have something to receive from me, and we want to move into a position of solidarity. What are we doing with the power that we have?
Yeah. L- Let me talk about it theologically. Because I think that as we unpack that, that becomes more evident.
Mm,
Um, Part of the struggle within um, the, this conversation is that I'm 30 years into asking this question of who the hell am I and why the hell am I and what in the world do I have to offer anybody in this world? Um, and the question of, my social place within the world and how to navigate the wounds of history that I've both inherited and participated in. I don't ever really know always what to do with that. Um, and I think I think it's really worth reckoning with how much our sense of being and our imaginations are tied up with the fundamental systems of our world, or what Dorothy Day would call this dirty, rotten system that all of us are participating in one way, shape, or form. And that when we talk about salvation, liberation, um, we're talking about everybody. And I mean, one of the things to reckon with is like when I read the Bible, and I don't know if you guys are Bible reading people or not, but when I step into it, I have a deep tendency to want to read myself into that story as uh, as a leper or the widow or the person in deep need, who Jesus is engaging with and asking particularly beautiful, liberative things from, right? But the truth is that if I read myself into the biblical story, I'm not those people. There's other characters within the story frame that I have much more collective in common with. And the things that Jesus asks of those characters are the things that scare me. It's not the stuff I actually like so much. I like, I want to be the leper in the narrative because, the hand of God comes and does beautiful things and invites them into all kinds of, collective, beautiful stuff. And, you know, if I read myself honestly, economically, socially, culturally into the framework of the narrative, what salvation looks like for those characters in the story is very different. And the invitation of the gospel meets us in different ways, liberative, beautiful ways, but, painful ways, cruciform ways. As you ask about what happens to this power, how do we relinquish power? Is it okay if I do this, Pete? I want
yeah,
to invite
yeah.
us into into a quick little little thought process.
Mhm.
So, if you look at the we have this terrorist friend. His name's Paul, and he wrote all these letters. And he wrote this letter to the church in Philippi, um, and he writes this letter to this fledgling church on the outskirts of Eastern Macedonia. And in it, in Philippians 2, he says this. He says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking at your own interests, but each of you to the interest of the other. And in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in the very nature God, does not consider equality with God as something to be used to his own advantage, power, right? Doesn't consider equality with God as to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he makes himself nothing by taking on the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbles himself to be obedient to death, even death upon a cross." This is solidarity. We see, if we hone in on this language, right? It says God does not consider who, being in the very nature God, does not consider his equality with God to be something to use in his own advantage. Rather, he makes himself nothing. In verse 7, this word nothing is a word that I know a lot of people have done a lot of work with over the years now. The word is kenosis in the Greek. And kenosis is not an empty word. It's not a lacking of something. It's a verb. It's an active frame. Kenosis means self-emptying. Or if I could push it deeper, I would say kenosis is about self-emptying, sacrificial love on behalf of the other. That's another good definition for what solidarity is
Mm.
about. It's about self-emptying, sacrificial love on behalf of the other, on the collective, right? And so we see this invitation from our terrorist friend Paul, who is advocating to the church in Philippi in their relationships with one another to cultivate a mindset, an imagination that is based upon kenosis, self-emptying, sacrificial love on behalf of the other. We're talking theologically about this thing called the incarnation, right? This thing we celebrate at this time of year called Christmas. This idea that God empties himself of God's self to enter into the suffering of the world, right? There is a movement of power. There is a downward mobility. There is a place of movement into the connectivity of salvation in suffering, because there's a recognition that that's where salvation occurs, in and amongst the places of pain in the world. And so a simple invitation for those of us who find ourselves in a place of power is to recognize that if we want to see, touch, embody the essence of what salvation is about in the gospel framework, it means a connection to, an embodiment with the places of this world that suffer. And so this is where service becomes problematic, because there's an assumption that we have much to give. And maybe there are certainly economic and fundamental needs that can be distributed and redistributed in ways that are necessary and meaningful. But imaginatively, humanly, the truth is that the more that I engage with my friends and communities that live a life of fundamental human suffering, the more that my humanity comes back into being, because it's what the gaining of power in a dirty, rotten system that I have accumulated in my own family history has come at a significant cost. And the cost is that I don't remember what it means to be a human being much anymore. And when I situate myself in deep relationality with people who have so much to teach me and so much to give, there's a mutuality of learnership that happens there when we step into a posture of solidarity. And it looks like this kenotic self-giving love, a process of self-emptying so that there can be an indwelling of newness that comes from that space. If you wanted to go deeper into Paul's letter, we can.
If we did, where would you take that?
So, I mean, there's a lot of places to go with that.
This is your sermon for the week, y'all. So
So
mm,
kenosis is this process of self-emptying, right? Self-emptying, sacrificial love on behalf of the other. It is kenosis. It is the essence of what the incarnation is about. It's the essence of God becoming a human being. This very peculiar, strange, perplexing, lunatic
mm,
type of belief that I hold in the nature of who and what God is and what God chose to do, right? And the incarnation is the greatest divide, the widest chasm, the longest tightrope walk ever walked. If we think about walls of hostility that have been traversed, the notion of God becoming man is by far the most severe chasm of separation that can possibly be healed, be connected to, right? The Berlin Wall, apartheid here in South Africa, American slavery, the reunification of the Korean Peninsula, partisan politics, hell, even Moses and the Red Sea doesn't have anything on the incarnation. Right? There is this significant thing that happens in the kenosising of God. And Paul, again, he situates that action of God as the invitation of what it means for those of us who come from places of power to relate to other human beings in the world. He says, have that mindset in our relationship with other peoples. And if you look at that historically and culturally, I mean, Paul is writing this letter to this church in Philippi, and Philippi at the time is this little fledgling church on the outskirts of this empire, this Roman Empire. and it's situated right on the edge of the Roman Empire, right at the very, Eastern Macedonia, at the edge of where the empire has expanded thus far. And there's this small church that has grown up there in the first, handful of years of this experiment of practicing resurrection, right? And what happens to this small community in this small city on the edge of the empire is that one year there's this economic boom that comes to the city. And it comes because there are these a number of army legions from the Roman Empire, from the Roman military that come into town. And when you're a small city and all of a sudden you have an influx of a couple thousand people, right? And all of their cattle and all of the things that have to go into that, there's an economic explosion in the city because all of a sudden people need grain and need food and need shelter. And so what happens in Philippi is there's this explosion of economic activity. And within this small church, there was also an explosion of economic activity. And so for the first time in the experience of the life of this community, there is a movement where there are those who are making it within the economic ladder and systems of the city, and there are those who are not making it. And so there is this economic rift that begins to cut through the heart of the Church of Philippi. And it is into this economic rift that Paul writes this letter. He writes this letter to this church and says, kenosis, self-emptying, sacrificial love on behalf of the other. Solidarity.
Hmm.
This is not the way that we organize ourselves as a community. It may be the way that the world at large and the city at large and the communities around us are organizing themselves. But for us Christian folk, this is not the way that we organize ourselves or cultivate an imagination of what it means to be a community and a people. No, for us, self-emptying, sacrificial love on behalf of the other.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Can we shift a little bit to what that actually looks like in practice?
Sure.
It's
What?
I'm a so much into theology. I wanted to have a whole separate call on that, and I like okay, let's bring it. Let's keep it on the ground also, because that's like essential theology and vision for like how do we understand this? How do we bring Jesus into this? Where's the connection between these nice ideas and like what we actually get from Scripture? So thank you for going into that. Um, I think maybe first I want to ask about you and your relationships, and then get to like projects and how you're trying to spread, like how you're trying to invite the
Sure.
church into this. Um, so you were in a place where your life, your vocation, like this is not just a set of ideas for you. You are moving into places of conflict. You are moving to places where are in community with people that at least my church would have growing up would have told you to go serve, and that would have been it. And you're trying to be in solidarity and friendship and relationship with them. What does it look like for you to move into those places and try to practice solidarity? And maybe even more importantly, um, I don't know, how do people respond? What are your friends around you looking for? What are you learning from them? It's a
Yeah.
ambiguous question. You can take whatever direction you want.
Sure. So I think there's two parts of that. And so one is the internal part, right? Is the recognition of how much the violence of our world and our city and the way that that systemic violence has also settled itself inside of me. And a lot of that is so built into the fabric of what it means to be alive today that those of us who have the choice to engage and disengage or have a very significant choice to make. And that internalized choice is one of choosing disruption in ourselves. Um, and there's very, very good reasons why people don't step into these type of frameworks and then relationships and then the implications of what it means to actually walk in solidarity with people who experience violence. Because to walk in solidarity with people who experience violence very quickly means that those who are perpetuating violence upon them find a new enemy in yourself. And so the violence that's often perpetuated upon others becomes violence that becomes perpetuated on you,
Mm,
which is the fundamental invitation to pick up one's cross and follow. It always leads to Golgotha. So I would say the first thing is to really reckon with the internal systems of violence within ourselves, to do that internal work of trying to think through and live through and wrestle through how the systems that I've grown up in, the education that I've had, the ways in which uh, the economic, social, cultural, racial frameworks of my life have built my imagination, sense of person and being. Um, and I don't think that that's like, let's have a book club. I think that's a lifelong endeavor and a pursuit of what I think discipleship is about internally. In peace building work, I think that's the inner transformation of the peacemaker. Again, recognizing how much the violence of our cities and communities is inside of us as well, and that this is actually where that work begins, especially for those of us who come from spaces and places of power. Um, we have to recognize that no matter what room, space, community we show up to, nobody shows up in a vacuum. We show up in histories. We show up in time and place with things that are happening in our city. We show up with our presumptions and assumptions and all of the unknown things that are happening around us that we simply don't have the purview or vantage of. And so I think the fundamental place to begin is within ourselves, and to begin this deep, deep re-educating process within ourselves. And that's something that people have to really navigate themselves. And as you begin that journey, um, I guess I would give a deep sense of encouragement along the way to, one, try to be gentle with yourself in the midst of how, like, recognizing that it is a painful process, to see how much the violence of our neighborhoods and communities and the suffering of others is built upon my own sense of being and comfort, right? That our lives don't happen in a vacuum, but that we live within a cycle and system of coexistence in this world. And that much of what I have gained has come off the back of many of us. And so I think that's the first place to go. And so that's internal. The second thing I think to begin to ask is how can we become um, deep learners of our cities? Um, Solidarity happens in place. It's not an imaginative thing. It's something that happens on soil, on ground, with others. Um, the work of justice is not something we do on webinars. It's a place where we can come together and push each other a little bit to be a little more courageous. But then at the end of the day, we have to go fail our way into coexistence in new ways. And so, again, so much of I mean, you all are in America, right? I'm in South Africa. In both of our contexts, there is a deep, deep, deep work at play, keeping us from understanding the nature of pain in our cities. In South Africa, in Cape Town, the spatial reality of the city is built in such a way that you can come, Cape Town was just named again in 2025 as the number one space to come on vacation by some major tourist magazine. And it's incredibly beautiful. Never mind the fact that 85% of the inhabitants of this city are suffering to find bread. Uh, Never mind the fact that we are 18,000 murders into the year this year. Just this year, what is it? March. We're 18,000 murders in March. That's more murders. It's more death in this city than there has been in many what are deemed war zones across the world right now, right? And this is a space and a place that you can come on vacation and experience the beauty of this city and never touch, see, feel those realities. And that's very intentional, right? The situation of our cities are built in such ways that we do not have to touch, see, feel those realities. And so for those of us, again, who have a choice to touch, see, or feel, um, I mean, the invitation is to begin to touch and see and feel, and to become learners of the ways that our cities function and work, especially from the vantage point and purview of those who are experiencing the most violence and the most suffering um, on behalf of the city's existence. And so that's educational work. And that's work that we really need to learn how to do. Um, and hopefully, the steps from there is recognizing that as you begin to work through your own internal turmoil and relearning your sense of being. For me, what happened is that the more that I wrestled with this stuff, the more there was a yearning,
Mm.
a growing yearning inside myself to want to actually feel what the hell it means to be alive in human relationships that aren't predicated on death. That of what does it mean to have relationships and to be part of a community that isn't built upon the suffering of others, right? Um, and so and so that began a pursuit of walking in relationship with people and making lots of mistakes along the way.
Mm. How do you sustain it? How do you
Oh, I
stay
don't.
healthy
I
in the
burn.
midst of that?
I burn out. I burn out every 4 or 5 years.
Oof.
I,
I
I
was,
I love that. I have two things to say
yeah,
about that.
yeah,
One,
yeah,
it's a
yeah.
really important question. One, it's a really important question. Two, it's a really pretentious question. Um, it's really important because taking care of ourselves is really, really important. I can say that because I've been into mental institutions from crashing out in different seasons because I just couldn't hold it together anymore. So I know there are ways to navigate the suffering of our communities without having it completely consume us. I know there are ways to do that. I haven't quite discovered them, but I know they exist. And the other thing is that while I think that it's really important to have those conversations and navigate them, I also think that it's a fundamental question itself based upon an imagination of choice.
Mm, mm-hmm,
Because it says, I want to touch the actual violence and suffering of my neighbors, but I want to do so safely. I don't want to grieve in such a deep capacity that I fall apart. And I can say that I recognize that there's a deep balancing act in that. And I don't have good answers for that. I've burnt out in different seasons of my life. I've really crashed out in different seasons of my life. I've also experienced tremendous deepening in solidarity and relationships and human contact and connection in the wake of those burnouts.
mm-hmm,
So I experienced some of that crashing, some of that danger as things that actually brought me into deeper relationality with actual friends who that's their everyday. Um, and so I think I think there's a danger in having that be the primary question because it's become a very pop question for a lot of
mm,
people working in justice circles these days that are like, how do we work in justice but make sure that we're safe? Or how do we make sure that our heads are on straight? And I want to go, yes, we need to be able to do that. And certainly I wish that as I was talking earlier, that internal work. I guess my biggest thing I would say back to myself 30 years ago is I wish I would have paid more attention to that when I was younger, because I really
mm,
didn't pay much attention to the internalized violence that was happening inside of me until years and years later, and likely, the amount of trauma that I was, experiencing and just absorbing in the lives around me and beginning to feel right. And the fact of the matter is also that those of us like us, we don't have a trauma um, buffer like my friends do.
mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? I don't even know how to
Uh,
say that. That
uh,
doesn't sound really terrible.
i-
But
if I were using trauma language, I would say for most of us, our window of tolerance is very small. It does not take
which is
much
the
to move
which
us
is the
into
wide
fight or flight.
the widest language of all time. Yes, but yeah, absolutely. And there's not a lot there
Mm-hmm,
before my body itself reacts and goes, "Oh my God."
mm-hmm,
Um, but that's the balancing act because part of the work of solidarity, of actually touching, feeling, connecting, engaging with the cost of what justice means and looks like in our communities, right? Means being willing to feel and take on some of the fire hose of suffering that others endure all the time.
mm-hmm.
And that's I guess that's the call of the gospel that a lot of us don't like. That's the one I don't like very much. That's the one when Jesus says, "Pick up your cross and follow." I'm like, yeah. to Applebee's after church, I'm in. But like, not to the neighborhood, like, not to a life where the systems of growing fascism in your neck of the woods are going to point their collective vehement anger upon you because of the types of activities and communities that you choose to walk in deep connection with. I mean, right now, if you
mm,
choose to situate your lives with different members of the American community, you know that choosing to situate your lives within those space, standing between the authority and those experiencing suffering, means that that anxiety, that fear, that pain, that is going to be predicated towards you, right? And that's the essence, I think, of what solidarity means when we find ourselves in situations of injustice, is a willingness to say, I choose to step into a depth of relationality with you, to experience the type of things that you're experiencing, because I want to stand in the places where God dwells.
mm,
The cross is many things, but one of the things that the cross is God's geography. It's like the cross is God's ultimate location pin upon the planet.
mm,
And so the invitation into a life of solidarity, as opposed to simply service, is a recognition that if I want to experience salvation, then I engage in the walk up Golgotha, right? That I walk into the places where God dwells, where God finds his most full embodiment in the world. Once crucified, always crucified. And if I want to worship the God who is crucified, then I find myself amongst the crucified of this world. But I'm gonna like uh, on Thursdays I want to do that. On Fridays I really don't feel like it. Um, and I
mm,
don't know.
mm,
So I don't know. I mean, we've been in South Africa for 15 years. I work with an organization called Iziko Lamangmaban, and Iziko is an organization. I have this weird title called the Director for International Solidarity. And our frame of existence is recognizing a couple things. One is that amongst the colonial wound and the colonial violence that has happened on this continent, as well as yours and other places, um, amongst all the types of violence that have happened, one of the forms of violence that has had a deep, deep impact is one of epistemological violence. By that, I simply mean that knowledge itself has been violated, the
mm,
sense that communities who have been colonized for centuries have been told that they don't have the capacity to think, to cultivate knowledge and wisdom. And part of living in the legacy of hundreds of years of that imagination is that much of our service in the world often lives on that same sociological framework. We have this
mm,
assumption that certain communities have things of wisdom to give and certain have things to inherit, right? And undoing that epistemological violence means cultivating deep solidarity and lifting up indigenous knowledges. And so one of the things that we are constantly engaged in here is working to connect what we call communities of struggle. At the sites of struggle. In South African Kairos theology, we get this language of the site of struggle. And the site of struggle being the place that we believe wisdom at its forefront is found, especially for peacemaking and justice work. One of the fundamental assumptions I have and that we have is that the understanding of how to solve our problems lives often within the communities of struggle themselves. But the epistemological violence predicated upon
mm,
communities means that that wisdom has not been granted the permission to actually work to heal the problems of our communities. And so part of learning how to share wisdom in new ways in solidarity is learning how to connect communities of struggle together in fresh, beautiful ways. And so that's my
mm,
weird job. My job is to help different communities of struggle get to know each other and become friends. Um, so one of the ways we've done that historically is through um, pathways of what we call pilgrimage. And so we will draw different communities and different contexts who've experienced tremendous violence together relationally, by exploring life within each other's communities for seasons. So we had a group of people from the DRC down in South Africa not too long ago, and spent some time for 2 weeks unpacking the history and the story of the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, and comparing, contrasting, dialogically learning about what it means in the context of the DRC right now. Last year, we had a group of young Palestinian activists in South Africa for the same kind of thing.
Is there a particular story or highlight of as you're connecting these communities and they're finding solidarity with each other? What's something that's come out of it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's hard. Um, again, I'm finding myself healed the more I walk in that work over the years. And part of it is reckoning with my own histories or lack thereof. Because one of the pains and tragedies and traumas of whiteness, especially for those of us who come from an American context, is that whiteness demands something of you. And one of the things that it demands of you is the negation of your ancestral
Mm,
historical roots. I mean, the story of whiteness in America, as well as it is here in South Africa, is one of choosing to cut off your pre-existence to your American identity space and losing your sense of cultural self um, in order to gain access to this thing we call whiteness in America. And that same framework has, been exported to South Africa as well. Um, and so I think the things that have always been so meaningful to me um, is is the sheer amount of joy um, that explodes in the place of meeting. Um, I mean, last year when we had this group of young Palestinians right in the middle of this season of what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in across the West Bank, right? This tremendous amount of violence, and we have this, of course, here as well. I mean, if you want to find the space of joy, of cultural um, reverberation, beauty, and dance and song, I mean, you look for it in the places of struggle. That's where it lives and dwells, right? Um, And when those spaces meet, right? I mean, South Africans can sing like nobody's business, especially our Zulu friends. Um, and we work primarily with Zulu folk in the context of Izikula Mangalan. And Palestinians can dance like nobody's business, right? And so to
mm,
see young South Africans and young Palestinians meet each other in the midst of shared histories and pains that are different, but um, similar, right? Different senses of a struggle against apartheid systems that um, have much in common, but are contextually unique. But to meet each other in the midst of those histories and pains,
mm,
and to begin to learn each other's songs and learn each other's dances, and to watch that deep sense of human co-participation, solidarity with one another's struggles manifest. And so for me, simply to be able to um, witness that type of deeply human connection,
mm,
I found to be so deeply healing, to be welcomed into that type of deep work, right? Because again, I mean, one of the deep yearnings inside of myself as a young white brother from America is a sense of I mean, it's an endless identity crisis, right? That's what it is for me. Um, and so to see these deep identities that go back centuries and centuries and centuries meet each other, um, it heals something in me. It draws something out of me in deep, beautiful ways. So
mm,
again, it's if there's any service being rendered there, there's a service being rendered amongst these people. They have the graciousness to invite me to participate and belong in that space,
mm.
and it's deeply healing.
It's beautiful. Thank you, Steve. Before we wrap up, I just want to give you a moment. Is there anything that's been on your mind that hasn't come up in a question, or any parting parting thoughts before we open up to questions?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, and I don't know any of y'all's stories or where you're at in various
Mm,
journeys or spaces either, but I know that in these type when we're having conversations in these types of environments, I know the question of this yearning to want to do something, but I don't know what the hell I'm supposed to do. I think is very deep in many of us, and so I guess my simple encouragement it, it is to just do something. The you know One of the great struggles of white people across the board everywhere is this legacy of puritanism. I don't know what it is within white folk. I see it everywhere in Europe. I see it everywhere in the States. We see it across South Africa as well. There's something about puritanism, um, and purity as a whole that has deeply indwelled itself within our sense of imagination. We see it within fundamentalism on the left and the right, whether you are the most conservative human person or the quote unquote most liberal human person. There is this deep tendency towards puritanism, and I don't understand it or know what it is. We want to get things right. We want to be right. We want to know what to do, when to do it, how to do it. And we want to do it the right way. And there has to be a right way. And we're going to do it and say it and be it the right way. And maybe that's just me, and I'm just projecting that upon all other human people who look like me. Could be. I don't think so, but maybe. Um, and so I think, regardless of where we step into this posturing towards wanting to do justice and engage in the great works of justice that are necessary in our neighborhoods and communities, check check the puritanism at the door.
mm,
Um, you don't have to do it right. There isn't a right. There's not a formula or formulaic process by which to engage. Um, check your power, um, always. Check the frameworks of how you enter space, for sure, and be mindful of the way that you, uh, occupy space and time with people. Learn to ask really good questions. Learn to be slow to speak, quick to listen. Um, don't be afraid to ask the questions that are really weird and difficult to ask. I mean, one of the questions you had, Peter, is what do people want from you in your solidarity? And I would say, I don't know, ask them. Um, you know, ask people, how can I help? What do you need from me? What do you want me to do? You know, I think sometimes we just have this assumptiveness that we're supposed to know or that we
mm,
can just do what we think. But, you know, there are communities and spaces, regardless of what types of things you want to get invested in. Um, I'm sure in all of your neighborhoods and places of opportunities to get engaged. Um, and so, the work of justice is something we do collectively. We need everybody, no matter where we enter that story from. It's a big party, man, and it's a big table, and we
mm,
all need to
mm,
sit at it. Um, and deep invitation is just to take the seat, and to step into it and to let the story unfold, um, bit by bit, day by day, year by year, and no, that's it.